Hi everyone, so for this problem we have a data question. Now remember, data questions involve tables and graphs and where we're pulling out information from that data in order to answer a question about the text. So let's take a look. So let's see, we have our question here, which is which choice best describes data from the table that support the researcher's claim? So we need to figure out what the researcher's claim is in order to answer this question. So let's take a look at the passage. So it looks like these researchers recently examined several plots within a diverse plant community in southeast Spain. The researchers calculated that if individual plants were randomly distributed on this particular landscape, only about 15% would be with other plants in patches of vegetation. They counted the number of juvenile plants of 5 species growing in patches of vegetation and the number growing alone on bare ground and compared those numbers to what would be expected if the plants were randomly distributed. Based on these results, they claim that plants of these species that grow in close proximity to other plants gain an advantage at an early developmental stage. Okay, so we have this claim at the very end here that plants of these species that grow in close proximity to other plants gain an advantage at an early developmental stage. Okay. So now let's take a look at our table. So remember, it's really important that we fully understand what the table is telling us so that we can answer the question correctly. So in our first column, we have the species that we're looking at. Then we have the bare ground, the patches of vegetation, and the total. So this is just a number of the number of plants that are growing. So we have the bare ground, the patches of vegetation, and the total. And then just a percentage of the amount found in the patches of vegetation. So, okay. So essentially looking at the different species, where they're growing as compared to bare ground and vegetation. So remember, we're supporting the researcher's claim again. So the claim is that the species that grow in close proximity to other plants gain an advantage at an early developmental stage. So bare ground is kind of growing on their own, and then growing in patches of vegetation is growing with others. So essentially, the ones that grow in patches of vegetation should be growing better. So let's see. Looking at A to start, for all 5 species, less than 75% of juvenile plants were growing in patches of vegetation. So it specifically says all 5 species, less than 75% of juvenile plants were growing in patches of vegetation. Okay. So it looks like all these percentages are below 75%. So that's accurate. But in terms of this claim about the proximity as opposed to not proximity, it doesn't mention anything about that. So we can get rid of A. Let's see B. So the species with the greatest number of juvenile plants growing in patches of vegetation was H. stochas. All right. So it looks like this is actually incorrect. So this is the last row of the table here. The greatest number of juvenile plants growing in patches of vegetation. So this actually has, it looks like the lowest percentage of found in patches of vegetation. So B would not be the best choice. And then for C, so looking at these 2 species, so T. lebantus and T. mauroderi, so the first 2 rows, the percentage of juvenile plants growing in patches of vegetation was less than what would be expected if plants were randomly distributed. Okay, so the percentage of juvenile plants growing in patches of vegetation was less than what would be expected if the plants were randomly distributed. Okay, so this is kind of going against the researcher's claim because this would be the opposite of what they're saying. So C doesn't seem like the best choice either. So that just leaves us with D. So let's see D. For each species, the percentage of juvenile plants growing in patches of vegetation was substantially higher than what would be expected if plants were randomly distributed. Okay, so we have for each species, the percentage of juvenile plants growing in patches of vegetation. Okay, so we're talking about these percentages again, was substantially higher than what would be expected if plants were randomly distributed. So I mean, essentially, since all of these percentages are greater than 50%, that's more than half. So that means that more than half of all the species of plants were growing in patches of vegetation as opposed to the bare ground. So this does support the researchers' claim that growing in proximity does give these plants an advantage. So D seems to work. So D is going to be the right answer.